I was standing in my garage watching the weather report when I realized this hurricane was going to be far worse than anyone had predicted. And my neighbors were about to learn a very expensive lesson about why you should never mess with an electrical engineer who holds all the cards. My name is Brandon Torres, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook Estates in Pensacola, Florida, for about 3 years. The neighborhood was one of those planned communities with perfectly manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and a homeowners association that seemed to think they were running a small dictatorship rather than a residential area. The houses were nice enough, 2-story constructions with modern amenities, and most of my neighbors were decent people just trying to live their lives. The problem was the HOA board, specifically the president, a woman named Patricia Henderson. Patricia was exactly what you would picture when someone says HOA president. She was in her late 40s, always wore pearls even when she was just checking her mail, and had that particular hairstyle that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager," from a mile away. She drove a white Lexus SUV with a custom license plate that read Hopers, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in finding violations to cite people for. Her favorite targets were anything she deemed unsightly, which apparently included children's toys left in yards overnight, Christmas decorations up past December 26th, and my generator. The generator had been a point of contention for about 6 months. I had purchased a commercial-grade Generac generator after the previous hurricane season, when we had lost power for 5 days. I worked from home as an electrical engineer consultant, and losing power meant losing income. More importantly, my elderly mother lived with me, and she needed power for her medical equipment. The generator was not some cheap portable unit you could buy at a hardware store. It was a proper standby generator that could power my entire house, professionally installed with all the proper permits and inspections. Patricia had sent me my first violation notice within a week of installation. The letter claimed the generator was an eyesore that violated the community aesthetic standards. I had laughed when I read it because the generator was installed behind my house, barely visible from the street, and painted to match my house exterior. I had followed every single rule in the HOA covenant, which I had read thoroughly before installation. There was nothing in the original covenant about generators. That was when I discovered that Patricia had convinced the board to pass a new rule 3 months before I moved in, buried in an amendment that banned external mechanical equipment visible from any public area or neighboring property. The rule was vague enough to apply to almost anything, and Patricia wielded it like a weapon. I had gone to the next board meeting to contest it. The meeting had been held in the Clubhouse, a fancy building near the neighborhood entrance that featured a pool gym and event space. About 20 homeowners were scattered around the room, most looking bored or frustrated. Patricia sat at the front table with the other board members. Gary Wilson, the treasurer who seemed afraid to contradict Patricia. Helen Martinez, the secretary who spent most meetings playing on her phone. And Douglas Chen, the only reasonable person on the board who actually tried to be fair. "Mr. Torres, your generator violates our community standards," Patricia had said, not even looking up from her notes. "According to a rule that was passed after the original covenant was written," I had replied, keeping my voice calm. "A rule that I had no opportunity to vote on or contest before I purchased my home, and my generator is barely visible. It is behind my house, screened by landscaping. It can be seen from the Johnson's second-floor window," Patricia had countered. "That makes it visible from a neighboring property. By that logic, everyone's air conditioning units would be violations, everyone's pool equipment, everyone's trash cans. "Those are necessities," she had said with a dismissive wave. "So is backup power for medical equipment," I had shot back. "My mother requires power for her oxygen concentrator and her medical bed. The generator is a medical necessity." That had made her pause, but only for a moment. "Then you can apply for a medical exemption, which requires documentation from a doctor, approval from the board, and an annual review." I had applied for the exemption, providing all the required documentation from my mother's cardiologist. The board had delayed the decision for 2 months, then approved it with conditions that included additional landscaping screening at my expense, a sound barrier wall, and monthly inspections. I had complied with everything, spending an additional $3,000 to satisfy their requirements. That had been 4 months ago, and Patricia had been looking for any excuse to revoke the exemption since then. She had sent her husband over twice to complain about noise, even though the generator only ran during my monthly tests and during power outages. She had cited me for the landscaping screening not being adequate, even though it exceeded the height requirements they had specified. She had even tried to claim the sound barrier wall was an unapproved structure, despite the fact that the board had required it. The week before Hurricane Melissa was forecast to hit the Gulf Coast, Patricia had sent me another letter. This one claimed that my generator posed a safety hazard during severe weather and would need to be disconnected before the storm arrived. The letter cited absolutely no actual safety codes or regulations, just Patricia's opinion that generators were dangerous during hurricanes. I had ignored the letter. Hurricane Melissa was a Category 3 storm with sustained winds of 120 miles per hour, and the entire region was under mandatory evacuation orders for coastal areas. Meadowbrook Estates was about 5 miles inland, so we were not under mandatory evacuation, but everyone was expecting significant damage and extended power outages. My generator was fueled, tested, and ready to go. The day before the storm hit, Patricia had shown up at my door with Gary Wilson in tow. I had been in the garage organizing my emergency supplies when I heard the doorbell. My mother was upstairs resting, and I wanted to avoid any confrontation that would upset her. "Mr. Torres," Patricia had said the moment I opened the door, "I see you have not complied with the board's directive to disconnect your generator." "That is correct," I had replied, "because your directive has no legal basis. My generator is properly permitted, properly installed, and I have a medical exemption." "The exemption does not apply during emergency conditions," she had said, pulling out a printed document. "According to this amendment, which was passed at last month's emergency board meeting, all exemptions are suspended during declared states of emergency." I had taken the document and scanned it quickly. It was exactly the kind of overreach I had come to expect from Patricia. The amendment had been passed with only 3 board members present, which I was pretty sure did not meet quorum requirements, and it had never been properly noticed to the homeowners. "This is not enforceable," I had said. "You did not have quorum, you did not provide proper notice, and you cannot suspend medical exemptions without cause. What you are doing is dangerous and potentially illegal. If you do not disconnect that generator, the board will take legal action," Patricia had threatened. "And we will fine you $100 per day until you comply. You do that," I had said, "and I will see you in court. Now get off my property. I have a hurricane to prepare for." Gary had looked uncomfortable, but Patricia had simply turned on her heel and marched back to her Lexus. I had watched them drive away, then gone back to my preparations. I had printed out copies of all the permits, the original HOA covenant, the exemption approval, and the documentation of every conversation I had had with the board. I had learned early on that dealing with Patricia required meticulous record keeping. The storm had hit that night around 10 in the evening. The wind had started picking up around dinner time, and by dark, the rain was coming down in sheets. My mother and I had eaten an early meal, and I had made sure all her medications were organized, and her medical equipment was plugged into the circuits connected to the generator. I had a transfer switch professionally installed that would automatically switch the house to generator power if the main power failed. The power had gone out at 10:47 p.m. I knew the exact time because I was watching the clock when the lights flickered twice and then died. About 15 seconds later, I heard the generator kick on and the lights came back. The transfer had been seamless. My mother had not even woken up. I had spent most of the night monitoring the storm and checking on the house. The wind had been incredible, howling like a living thing and rattling the hurricane shutters I had closed over all the windows. I had heard crashes and bangs from outside that I knew were trees coming down and debris flying around. At one point, something large had hit the side of the house hard enough to shake the walls. But inside, we had light, air conditioning, and power. The storm had passed by around 6 in the morning, and I had waited until 8 to venture outside. The damage was extensive. Trees were down everywhere, blocking streets and crushing fences. Shingles and siding littered the ground. One house down the street had lost its entire roof. My house had been relatively lucky. I had lost some shingles, a section of fence in the backyard, and several large branches, but nothing structural. The generator was still running perfectly, housed in its protective enclosure. I had walked around the neighborhood to assess the damage. Most of my neighbors were outside doing the same thing, looking shell-shocked at the destruction. The power lines were down in multiple locations, and several utility poles were snapped like toothpicks. I knew from experience that it would be at least a few days before power was restored, possibly longer. That was when I had noticed something interesting. The clubhouse had extensive damage. A large oak tree had fallen directly onto the building, crushing part of the roof and one entire wall. But more importantly, I could see that the clubhouse had its own dedicated power infrastructure. It was on a separate transformer from the residential areas, and it had its own meter and service panel. I had designed electrical systems for commercial buildings for over a decade. What I was looking at was a system where the clubhouse had been added to the neighborhood's power grid after the original development, probably when they upgraded the facilities 5 years ago. And from what I could see, whoever had designed it had done something either very clever or very stupid, depending on your perspective. The clubhouse power supply ran through an easement that crossed my property. Not just near my property, but directly through my backyard. When the HOA had expanded the clubhouse, they had needed to run a new electrical line from the main substation on the other side of the development. Rather than running it along the street, which would have required extensive permits and road work, they had run it through the easements behind several properties, including mine. I had reviewed the easement documents when I purchased my house, as any sensible person would. The easement gave the HOA the right to maintain electrical infrastructure across a 10-foot strip of my backyard. What it did not give them was unlimited access or the right to prevent me from building on my property, as long as I maintained access to their equipment. More importantly, the easement agreement required them to maintain their equipment and ensure it did not create hazards for the property owners. Standing in my backyard that morning, looking at the junction box where the clubhouse line connected to the main distribution panel, I had realized something that made me smile. The junction box was on my property, just outside the easement boundary. And according to the county records I had reviewed when installing my generator, that junction box was technically part of my property's electrical system. The HOA's electrical contractor had installed it there because it was the most convenient location, but they had never properly documented the installation or obtained an easement extension for that specific box. It was a technicality, but it was a significant one. That junction box was the main connection point for the clubhouse power supply. Without it, the clubhouse had no power, and it was sitting on my property, connected to my electrical infrastructure. I had gone back inside and pulled up all my property documents, the easement agreements, and the electrical permits. I spent 2 hours reviewing everything and confirming what I had suspected. The junction box was mine. The HOA had no legal right to it without my permission. They had probably assumed that because they had an easement for the power line, they could install whatever they wanted wherever they wanted. But easements do not work that way. The easement gave them rights to the power line within a specific boundary. The junction box was outside that boundary. Around noon, I had gotten a knock on my door. It was my neighbor, Frank Johnson, who lived 2 houses down. Frank was a good guy, a retired firefighter who kept to himself and never got involved in HOA drama. "Brandon, you got power?" he had asked, looking exhausted. "Generator is running," I had said. "You need anything? Water? Ice?" "No, we are okay for now, but Patricia is going around telling everyone that you need to share your generator with the neighborhood. She is saying it is community property or something." I had laughed at that. "She is out of her mind. My generator is my private property." "That is what I told her," Frank had said, "but she is working herself up into a state. Thought you should know." Sure enough, about an hour later, Patricia had arrived at my door again. This time she had Helen Martinez with her and was carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Torres, we need to discuss the generator situation," Patricia had begun without preamble. "There is no situation," I had said. "I have power, you do not. That is how generators work. The board has decided that during this emergency, your generator should be used to provide power to the clubhouse," Patricia had announced. "The clubhouse will serve as a community shelter and resource center. We need power for refrigeration, communication, and basic necessities." "No," I had said simply. "Excuse me." Patricia's face had started to turn red. "No, my generator powers my house. It is designed and sized to power my house. It cannot power the clubhouse." "You are an electrical engineer. You can figure something out," Patricia had insisted. "Even if I could, which I cannot without completely rewiring both systems, I would not. You just spent the last 6 months trying to force me to remove my generator. You sent me a letter 2 days ago demanding I disconnect it. You threatened me with fines and legal action. And now you want me to use it to help you. This is different. This is an emergency," Helen had interjected. "It was an emergency when I installed the generator in the first place," I had countered. "An emergency for my mother's medical needs. You did not care then. You made me jump through hoops, spend thousands of dollars, and fight for months to keep equipment that is potentially life-saving. So no, you do not get to benefit from it now." "This is incredibly selfish," Patricia had said, her voice rising. "There are elderly people in this neighborhood. Families with children. They need help." "Then they should have thought about that before electing an HOA board that banned generators," I had replied. "Anyone who wants to charge their phones or fill water bottles is welcome to come to my house. I will help my neighbors." "But I will not help the HOA. We could force you," Patricia had threatened. "Eminent domain. Emergency powers." "The HOA does not have eminent domain authority," I had said, struggling to keep my patience. "And emergency powers do not allow you to seize private property. You are welcome to try, but I guarantee you will end up in legal trouble. Now please leave." They had left, but I knew it was not over. Patricia was the type of person who could not stand being told no. I had gone back to helping my neighbors, running extension cords to the houses on either side so they could power refrigerators and charge devices. I had given out ice and water from my supplies. I had helped Frank clear a fallen tree from his driveway. I had done everything I could to be a good neighbor. What I had not done was help the HOA. Over the next 2 days, the situation in the neighborhood had become increasingly tense. The power company had announced that full restoration would take at least a week, possibly 2. The main transmission lines were severely damaged, and repair crews were working around the clock. The clubhouse had become the center of HOA operations, despite the damage. Patricia had set up tables in the undamaged section and was trying to coordinate neighborhood recovery efforts. Without power, though, the clubhouse was mostly useless. The refrigerators were not working, so they could not store food or cold drinks. The air conditioning was off, and in the Florida heat and humidity, the building was like an oven. The computers and printers were dead, so all the HOA records and communications were inaccessible. Patricia was trying to run everything from her phone, but cell service was spotty at best. I had watched all of this with a certain amount of satisfaction. My house was comfortable. My mother was safe and healthy. I was working remotely, taking advantage of my reliable power and internet connection. Life was relatively normal for us while everyone else was struggling. On the 3rd day after the storm, Douglas Chen had come to visit me. Douglas was the only board member I respected. He was a patent attorney who had gotten roped onto the board because no one else wanted to volunteer. He actually read the covenant and bylaws, and he called Patricia out when she overstepped, though she usually ignored him. "Brandon, can we talk?" Douglas had asked. He looked tired and frustrated. "Sure, come in," I had said, stepping aside. "You want some cold water? Soda? Cold anything sounds amazing," he had said gratefully. I had poured him a glass of ice water and grabbed a couple of sodas from the refrigerator. We had sat in my living room, and I could see him looking around at the lights, the running ceiling fan, and the television displaying the news. "This is about the generator and the clubhouse," Douglas had said after taking a long drink. "I am going to be straight with you. Patricia screwed up. She screwed up badly. That stunt with the letter before the storm was out of line, and the new amendment was probably not legal. I voted against it, for what it is worth." "I appreciate that," I had said. "The problem is, now we actually do need power at the clubhouse," Douglas had continued. "Not for Patricia's ego, but because FEMA is setting up a distribution center there tomorrow. They are bringing supplies, food, water, medical assistance, but they need power to run their equipment." That had given me pause. FEMA distribution centers were important. People needed help. But I was still not inclined to help Patricia. "Why do they not bring generators?" I had asked. "They are, but not enough for the whole facility." They asked if we had any backup power, and Patricia told them we did, which was a lie. Now she is scrambling to find a solution. "Still not my problem," I had said. "Patricia lied to FEMA. That is on her." "I know," Douglas had sighed. "And I do not blame you, but I am asking, not as a board member but as a neighbor, is there anything you could do, even temporarily?" I had thought about it. The right thing to do would be to help. People needed assistance, and I had the technical knowledge to potentially provide it. But Patricia had made this situation. She had created this problem through her own arrogance and pettiness. If I helped now, she would never learn, and she would continue to abuse her power. "I will think about it," I had said finally, "but I want something in return." "Name it," Douglas had said. First, the board formally rescinds all the restrictions and requirements on my generator. The exemption becomes permanent and unconditional. Second, Patricia issues a written apology for the harassment and the letter before the storm. Third, the board pays me back the $3,000 I spent on the unnecessary screening and sound wall. And fourth, the board establishes clear, reasonable guidelines for backup generators that cannot be changed without a full homeowner vote. Douglas had nodded slowly. I can get behind all of that, but I will need the full board to vote on it, and you know Patricia will fight it. Then she can run her FEMA center without power, I had said. Those are my terms. Douglas had left and I had gone back to my work. I had felt a little guilty about playing hardball during a disaster, but I reminded myself that Patricia had started this fight. She had been the one who decided that her aesthetic preferences were more important than medical necessities and disaster preparedness. I was just following through on the logical consequences of her decisions. That evening, Douglas had called me. Emergency board meeting in an hour. Can you come to the clubhouse? Will it be productive? I had asked. Probably not, but I think you should be there to present your terms directly, he had said. Fair warning, Patricia is furious. I had agreed and walked to the clubhouse. The sun was setting, and the temperature was finally dropping below 90 degrees. The neighborhood was eerily quiet without the normal sounds of air conditioners and televisions. People were sitting on their porches, trying to catch any breeze. The clubhouse was sweltering. The board members were sitting at a folding table lit by battery-powered lanterns. Patricia looked like she had not slept in days. Gary was sweating profusely. Helen was fanning herself with a paper folder. Douglas was the only one who looked relatively composed. There were about 15 other homeowners present, including Frank Johnson and several other neighbors I recognized. Everyone looked tired and uncomfortable. This meeting is called to order, Patricia had announced. We are here to discuss the power situation and Mr. Torres's generator. I understand FEMA needs power, I had said, standing up. I am willing to help, but I have conditions. I had laid out my 4 requirements. The room had been silent as I spoke. When I finished, several homeowners had started nodding in agreement. Those are your demands. Patricia had asked coldly. Those are my terms, I had corrected. You have been harassing me about my generator for 6 months. You threatened me 2 days before a major hurricane. And now you want my help. So yes, these are my terms. This is extortion, Patricia had said. No, this is negotiation, I had replied. Extortion would be if I threatened you. I am not threatening anyone. I am offering to help in exchange for the board correcting its past mistakes and ensuring this situation does not happen again. I agree to the terms, Douglas had said immediately. We should have done most of this already. I move that we approve all 4 of Mr. Torres's conditions. I second, Helen had said quietly. Gary had looked at Patricia, who was glaring at everyone. This is ridiculous, Patricia had said. We should not be negotiating with someone who is holding the neighborhood hostage. He is not holding anyone hostage, Frank Johnson had called out from the audience. You are the one who tried to ban generators. If more people had them, we would not be in this mess. Several other homeowners had voiced agreement. Patricia had looked around, realizing she was losing control of the room. Fine, she had said finally. I agree to conditions 1, 3, and 4, but I will not apologize. I was doing my job as HOA president. Then no deal, I had said simply. The apology is non-negotiable. You accused me of creating a safety hazard with no evidence. You threatened me with fines. You tried to force me to disconnect life-saving equipment. You owe me an apology. I will resign first, Patricia had said dramatically. Works for me, I had replied. Douglas can be acting president. The terms stay the same. Douglas had looked shocked but not displeased. Gary and Helen had exchanged glances. All in favor of accepting Mr. Torres's terms, Douglas had called out. Douglas and Helen had said together. Gary had hesitated, looking at Patricia, then finally said, "Aye." "The motion passes 3-1, Douglas had announced. "Patricia, you can write the apology letter tonight or you can resign. Your choice." Patricia had stood up so fast her chair fell over. "This is not over," she had hissed at me, then stormed out of the clubhouse. I had stayed to work out the details with Douglas. The technical challenge was actually significant. My generator was sized for my house, producing about 22 kilowatts. The clubhouse needed substantially more power, especially with FEMA equipment. But I had an idea. "The clubhouse does not need full power," I had explained. "It needs enough to run refrigeration units, some lights, and FEMA computers and communications equipment. That is maybe 10 kilowatts, 12 at most. The problem is running a line from my house to here." "Can we do it?" Douglas had asked. "We can, but it will take work," I had said. "I will need to rent a larger generator, set it up at my house, and run temporary power lines to the clubhouse. It is not elegant, but it will work. It will take most of tomorrow to set up." "How much will it cost?" Gary had asked nervously. "Generator rental for a week will be about $800, I had said. "Cable and supplies may be another $300, call it $1,200 total." "The board will cover it," Douglas had said. "Do it." I had gone home and spent the evening planning the installation. It was going to be a jury-rigged setup, but it would work. I would rent a 40-kilowatt diesel generator, large enough to power both my house and provide substantial power to the clubhouse. I would run temporary cables through the backyards along the easement route, following the existing underground power line. It was not pretty, but it was functional. The next morning, I had driven to a rental company about 30 miles away that had generators in stock. The roads were still partially blocked, and the drive took over an hour. I had rented the largest unit they had available and had them deliver it to my house. While I waited for delivery, I had started preparing the installation. That was when I had taken a closer look at the junction box in my backyard. The one that connected the clubhouse to the main power grid. The one that was technically on my property. An idea had started forming. A terrible, petty, wonderful idea. I had spent the morning documenting everything. I took photographs of the junction box, its location relative to the property lines and the easement boundaries. I pulled up the original installation permits and confirmed that the box had been installed without proper authorization on my property. I reviewed the easement agreement and confirmed that it did not cover that specific installation. Then, I had opened the junction box and examined the connections. It was a straightforward setup. The main feed from the substation came in on one side. The line to the clubhouse ran out the other side. There was a disconnect switch that would allow the clubhouse line to be isolated from the main feed. I had taken more photographs, then carefully disconnected the clubhouse feed. It took about 15 minutes. I had labeled everything so I could reconnect it later if needed, but for now, the clubhouse was electrically isolated. Even when the main power came back on, the clubhouse would have no power unless I reconnected it. The generator had arrived around noon, and I had spent the afternoon setting it up and running the temporary power lines. By 5 in the evening, I had the system operational. My house was running on my original generator. The temporary line to the clubhouse was ready to connect to the rental generator. Everything was set. Douglas had come by to check on the progress. "This is amazing," he had said, looking at the setup. "You did all this in one day." "It is not complicated if you know what you are doing," I had said. I will fire up the rental unit and get power to the clubhouse in about an hour. FEMA should have everything they need. Patricia still has not written the apology letter, Douglas had said quietly. She has been at home all day. I think she is trying to figure out how to get out of it. She has 24 hours, I had said. That was the agreement. If I do not have a written apology by tomorrow night, I am pulling the power. She will call your bluff, Douglas had warned. It is not a bluff, I had replied. I had started the rental generator and connected the feed to the clubhouse. About 30 seconds later, I had seen lights come on in the building. The FEMA team that had arrived earlier that day had immediately started setting up their equipment. By evening, the distribution center was operational, and people were lining up for supplies. I had felt good about that part. Helping people get food, water, and medical supplies was the right thing to do. But I was still waiting for Patricia's apology. The next day had been busy. People were coming and going from the FEMA center all day. The Red Cross had set up a station there as well. The clubhouse had become the center of recovery operations for the entire neighborhood, and it was all running on my generators. I had kept working, helping neighbors where I could and monitoring my equipment. The generators were performing perfectly. My mother was comfortable and healthy. Life was surprisingly normal considering we were in the middle of a disaster area. By evening, I still had not received an apology from Patricia. Douglas had stopped by around 6. She is not going to do it, he had said. She says she does not owe you an apology and that you are being unreasonable. Then she can lose power to the clubhouse, I had said. Brandon, there are hundreds of people depending on that center now, Douglas had said. You cannot just shut it down. Watch me, I had replied. We had an agreement. The board voted on it. Patricia agreed to it even if she did not want to. She has had 24 hours to write a simple apology letter. She has chosen not to. That means the agreement is void. Can we extend the deadline? Douglas had asked. Give her another day. No, I had said firmly. I am not going to keep moving the goalposts for her. She needs to learn that actions have consequences. Tell her she has until 8 p.m. That is 2 more hours. If I do not have a written, signed apology by then, I am shutting down the generator. Douglas had left looking worried. I had felt a little bad about putting him in the middle of this, but Patricia had created this situation. She had had multiple opportunities to resolve it, and she had chosen pride over practicality every time. At 7:45 p.m., I had gone out to the rental generator. I wanted to be ready to shut it down at exactly 8 if necessary. I was not bluffing. I had meant every word. At 7:52, I had seen Patricia walking down the street toward my house. She was moving slowly, and even from a distance, I could see she was furious. She had been holding a piece of paper. Here, she had said, shoving the paper at me when she reached my driveway. Your apology. I had taken it and read it carefully. It was typed, formal, and about as sincere as a hostage video, but it was technically an apology. It acknowledged that she had inappropriately threatened me regarding the generator, that the letter before the storm was unjustified, and that she regretted any distress her actions had caused. It was signed and dated. This is acceptable, I had said. Thank you. Do not thank me, Patricia had spat. You forced my hand. You held the neighborhood hostage to satisfy your ego. I protected my property rights and ensured the HOA could not abuse its power in the future, I had corrected. If you had just been reasonable 6 months ago, none of this would have been necessary. We will see how reasonable you think I am, Patricia had said cryptically, then turned and walked away. I had watched her go, feeling uneasy. That sounded like a threat. I had taken the apology letter inside and scanned it into my computer, making several backup copies. Then, I had emailed Douglas to confirm I had received it and that the agreement was fulfilled. The power had stayed on at the clubhouse. FEMA had continued their operations. The neighborhood had continued to recover, and I had continued to monitor everything carefully because I knew Patricia was not done. I had been right to be cautious. 3 days later, after the main power had been restored to most of the neighborhood, I had received a letter from the HOA attorney. It was a demand letter, claiming that I owed the HOA $15,000 for unauthorized use of HOA electrical infrastructure and damages to HOA property. I had laughed when I read it. It was such obvious nonsense that I was amazed any attorney had agreed to write it. I had not used their infrastructure. I had provided power to their building using my own equipment. I had not damaged anything. If anything, I had improved their situation, but the letter had given me an idea. I had pulled out all my documentation on the junction box in my backyard, the one that was on my property, the one they had no right to, and I had written a letter of my own. My letter, sent to the HOA board and copied to their attorney, had pointed out that the junction box in my backyard was installed on my property without authorization. It was outside the easement boundary, and no additional easement had been granted. The HOA had been trespassing on my property and using my property for their electrical infrastructure without permission or compensation. I had demanded $20,000 in compensation for the unauthorized use of my property over the past 5 years. I had also informed them that I had disconnected their electrical feed at that junction box, and it would remain disconnected until the property rights issue was resolved. The effect had been immediate and dramatic. Within hours, Douglas had called me. "What did you do?" he had asked, sounding panicked. "I protected my property rights," I had said calmly. "Did you know that junction box was on my property, outside the easement?" "I did not," Douglas had admitted. "But now the clubhouse has no power, even though the main grid is back online." "Correct," I had said. "And it will stay that way until the board withdraws its ridiculous demand letter and compensates me for the unauthorized use of my property." "Patricia is losing her mind," Douglas had said. "Also not my problem," I had replied. "She should have thought about this before she had her attorney send me a threatening letter." "The clubhouse lease is tied to it having power," Douglas had said. "We could lose our lease if we cannot provide power to the building." That was interesting. I had not known that. "Then you should resolve this quickly," I had said. Over the next few days, the situation had escalated further. The HOA's attorney had sent another letter threatening legal action. I had responded by filing a complaint with the county code enforcement about the unpermitted electrical installation on my property. The county had sent an inspector who had confirmed that the junction box was improperly located and lacked proper permits. The inspector had issued a violation notice to the HOA, giving them 30 days to correct the issue. The correction would require either obtaining a proper easement from me, which I was not inclined to grant, or completely rerouting their electrical service, which would cost tens of thousands of dollars. Patricia had tried to rally the neighborhood against me, sending out an email blast claiming I was sabotaging the community. It had backfired spectacularly. Most of the homeowners remembered that I had been the one providing power during the hurricane recovery. They remembered that I had helped my neighbors while Patricia had been focused on HOA politics. And several homeowners had started asking questions about other HOA expenditures and decisions. A group of homeowners had demanded a special meeting to review the board's actions. The meeting had been held 2 weeks after the hurricane, and it had been packed. Over 100 homeowners had showed up, filling the clubhouse and spilling outside. Douglas had chaired the meeting since Patricia had been one of the topics under review. Homeowners had raised concerns about the generator ban, the handling of hurricane preparations, the threatening letter to me, and several other issues. Multiple people had called for Patricia's resignation. Patricia had defended herself, claiming she had been acting in the community's best interests. She had accused me of being vindictive and selfish. She had tried to paint herself as the victim of my unreasonable demands. Then I had stood up and presented my documentation. All of it. The permits for my generator, the medical exemption application and approval, the additional requirements the board had imposed, the letter demanding I disconnect the generator before the storm, the documentation of how I had provided power during the recovery, the photographs of the improperly installed junction box, the demand letter from the HOA attorney, everything. The room had been silent as I had gone through it all. When I had finished, Frank Johnson had stood up. "I move that we remove Patricia Henderson from the HOA board effective immediately," he had said. Second, another homeowner had called out. The vote had been overwhelming. Patricia had been removed from the board by a vote of 87-12. Gary Wilson had also been voted out for enabling her behavior. Helen Martinez had resigned on the spot rather than face a vote. Douglas had been elected as the new president, and 2 other homeowners had been appointed to fill the vacant board positions. The first action of the new board had been to withdraw the demand letter against me and to negotiate a settlement for the junction box issue. The settlement had been reasonable. The HOA had paid me $5,000 for the past unauthorized use of my property and had agreed to obtain a proper easement for the junction box at a cost of $1 per year. In exchange, I had reconnected their power and agreed not to pursue further claims. The new board had also immediately passed a resolution encouraging homeowners to install backup generators and removing all the restrictions Patricia had implemented. They had refunded my $3,000 for the unnecessary screening requirements and had formally apologized for the board's previous conduct. But the story had not ended there. About a month after Patricia's removal from the board, I had gotten a call from the county attorney's office. They had asked if I would be willing to come in for an interview regarding the HOA's conduct during the hurricane. It had turned out that Patricia had not just been overzealous, she had been corrupt. The county investigation, triggered by the code enforcement complaint and the complaints from multiple homeowners, had uncovered that Patricia had been embezzling HOA funds for over 2 years. The unnecessary screening requirements she had imposed on me and several other homeowners had been through a landscaping company owned by her brother-in-law, who had then kickbacked a portion of the fees to her. The demand letter to me for $15,000 had been part of a pattern of fraudulent claims she had made against homeowners who challenged her authority. She had settled several of these claims for a few $1,000s each, and the money had gone into HOA accounts that she controlled and used for personal expenses. In total, Patricia had stolen over $80,000 from the HOA over 2 years. The county attorney had filed criminal charges against her for fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of position. Her brother-in-law had also been charged with conspiracy and fraud. The investigation had expanded to include Gary Wilson, who had known about some of the financial irregularities but had not reported them. He had eventually taken a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Patricia in exchange for probation and restitution. The trial had been about 6 months after the hurricane. I had been called as a witness to testify about Patricia's conduct regarding my generator and the demand letter. It had been satisfying to tell the story in court, under oath, with Patricia sitting at the defense table looking furious. The jury had convicted her on all counts. She had been sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Her brother-in-law had received 2 years and had also been ordered to pay restitution. The HOA had recovered most of the stolen money through the restitution orders and through a settlement with the HOA's insurance company. Douglas and the new board had used some of that money to upgrade the clubhouse facilities and to establish an emergency preparedness fund. They had also purchased a commercial generator for the clubhouse, properly permitted and installed. The neighborhood had changed significantly after the hurricane and Patricia's downfall. People were more engaged with the HOA, actually reading the meeting minutes and attending meetings. The new board was transparent and reasonable, and they focused on actually maintaining the community rather than petty rule enforcement. Several other homeowners had installed generators. Frank Johnson had put in a system similar to mine. The Martins 3 houses down had installed solar panels with battery backup. The neighborhood had become genuinely prepared for future storms. My relationship with my neighbors had improved as well. People remembered who had helped during the crisis. They remembered who had stood up to an abusive HOA board. I had gone from being just another resident to being someone people trusted and respected. My mother had been amused by the whole saga. "You did not have to go to war with them," she had said one evening as we sat on the porch. "Yes, I did," I had replied. Patricia needed to learn that she could not bully people, and the neighborhood needed to learn that HOAs are supposed to serve the homeowners, not rule over them. Still, it was quite a lot of drama over a generator, she had said with a smile. It was never about the generator, I had said. It was about the principle, about standing up to unreasonable authority, about making sure that property rights mean something. She had patted my hand. "I am proud of you," she had said, "even if you are stubborn as a mule." I had laughed. "I learned from the best," I had said. The following year, hurricane season had come around again. We had not had any major storms hit our area, but we had been prepared. My generator had been maintained and ready. The clubhouse generator had been tested monthly. The neighborhood had evacuation plans and communication networks established. And when the HOA had sent out the annual hurricane preparedness notice, it had included a section encouraging homeowners to consider backup power options and offering to help coordinate bulk purchases of generators at discounted rates. It had been a far cry from Patricia's regime of bans and threats. I had occasionally wondered what Patricia was doing. I had heard through the neighborhood gossip that she had been released from prison after serving 18 months of her sentence. She had moved out of state, probably to escape the shame and notoriety. Her husband had divorced her during the trial. Her brother-in-law had also left the area after his release. I had not felt sorry for her. She had made her choices. She had chosen to abuse her power, to steal from her neighbors, and to prioritize her ego over the community's welfare. The consequences had been entirely of her own making. As for me, life had returned to normal. I had continued my work as an electrical engineering consultant. I had continued to care for my mother. I had become more involved in the neighborhood, serving on committees and helping with community events. I had even been asked to join the HOA board, though I had declined. I had no desire to be on the board. I had just wanted the board to be reasonable, and under Douglas's leadership, it was. The generator sat in my backyard, quietly humming during its monthly tests, ready to spring into action if needed. The junction box was now properly documented and legally on my property, with the HOA paying their annual dollar for the easement right. The screening and sound walls had been removed, saving me maintenance and giving me back some yard space. Everything had worked out exactly as it should have. The neighborhood was better. The HOA was functional and fair. And I had proven that sometimes standing up to petty tyrants was not just the right thing to do, it was the necessary thing. Looking back, I could trace the entire chain of events to that one decision to install a generator. A simple, reasonable decision to protect my family during emergencies. Patricia had seen it as a challenge to her authority, and she had escalated at every opportunity. She had never understood that the generator was not the issue. The issue was her need to control everything and everyone. If she had simply approved my initial installation, or even just left me alone after the medical exemption was granted, none of the rest would have happened. She would still be HOA president. She would not be a convicted felon. The HOA would not have lost $80,000, but she could not leave it alone. She had to push, had to threaten, had to try to force me to comply, and in the end, that had been her downfall. Because she had picked a fight with someone who understood the rules better than she did, who documented everything, and who was willing to stand firm on principle. She had expected me to back down, to accept her authority, to comply with her unreasonable demands. Instead, I had turned her own overreach against her. The night before the hurricane, when she had demanded I disconnect my generator, she had set in motion a chain of events that would end with her in prison. If she had just stayed home that night, if she had just let it go, everything would have been different. But Patricia Henderson was incapable of letting anything go, and that had been her fatal flaw. I thought about all of this as I sat on my porch one evening, about 18 months after the hurricane. The sun was setting over the neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. My neighbors were out walking their dogs, kids were playing in yards, and the sound of lawnmowers and conversation filled the air. It was peaceful and normal and everything a neighborhood should be. My mother came out and sat in the chair next to mine. "Beautiful evening," she said. "It is," I agreed. "The new family that moved into Patricia's old house seems nice," she commented. "I met the wife today. She was asking about the neighborhood." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her it was a great place to live," my mother said with a smile. "I told her we had an excellent HOA board, good neighbors, and that her husband should definitely install a generator." I laughed. "Did you tell her why?" "I told her we take hurricane preparedness seriously around here," she said, "which is true." "Also true," I acknowledged. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the neighborhood settle in for the evening. The generator was quiet in the backyard, but I knew it was there, ready and waiting. It was more than just a piece of equipment now. It was a symbol of something important. A reminder that standing up for yourself matters. That principles matter. That sometimes the little battles are worth fighting because they are really about bigger things. Patricia had seen the generator as an eyesore, as something that diminished her perfect vision of the neighborhood. I had seen it as security, as protection for my family, as a basic and reasonable precaution. We had both been willing to fight over it, but for very different reasons. She had fought to maintain control and appearances. I had fought to protect my rights and my family. In the end, the generator had exposed the rot at the heart of the HOA. It had revealed Patricia's corruption, her willingness to abuse power, and her complete disregard for the homeowners she was supposed to serve. It had forced the neighborhood to wake up and pay attention to what their HOA was doing, and it had ultimately led to real, positive change. Sometimes a generator is not just a generator. Sometimes it is the thing that changes everything. And sometimes standing your ground, even when it seems petty or stubborn, is exactly the right thing to do. Because principles matter, rights matter, and nobody should be able to bully you into giving up either one. As darkness fell, and the lights came on in houses around the neighborhood, powered by the reliable electrical grid and backed up by numerous generators that were now welcomed rather than banned. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The neighborhood had learned its lesson. The HOA had learned its lesson. And Patricia Henderson had learned the hardest lesson of all, that when you abuse power, eventually that power will be taken away. My mother stood up to go inside. "Coming in?" she asked. "In a minute," I said. "I am just enjoying the evening." She squeezed my shoulder as she passed. "Do not stay out too long. You have that conference call in the morning." "I will not," I promised. After she went inside, I sat for a few more minutes, thinking about everything that had happened. The hurricane, the confrontations, the investigation, the trial, and the aftermath. It had been exhausting and stressful, but ultimately worth it. The neighborhood was better. The HOA was better. And I had proven that you do not have to accept unreasonable authority, even when that authority comes with official titles and threatening letters. The generator hummed to life for its evening test cycle, right on schedule. I smiled at the sound. That sound represented safety, security, and the freedom to make decisions for my own property without interference from petty tyrants. It was the sound of victory, even if it was a small, domestic, suburban kind of victory. I stood up and went inside, turning off the porch light behind me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new work. But tonight, I could rest easy knowing that my family was safe, my rights were protected, and my neighborhood was in good hands. And if another hurricane came, we would be ready, all of us, together. That was what community was supposed to be about. Not rigid rules and aesthetic standards enforced by power-hungry board members, but neighbors helping neighbors, people preparing together, and everyone looking out for each other. The hurricane had taught us that lesson. Patricia's downfall had reinforced it. And the generator, that simple piece of equipment that had started everything, stood as a permanent reminder. As I locked the door and headed upstairs, I passed the framed apology letter from Patricia hanging in my study. Douglas had suggested I burn it after the trial, but I had kept it and framed it instead. Not as a trophy or to gloat, but as a reminder. A reminder that you should always document everything, always stand up for your rights, and never assume that authority figures have your best interests at heart. The letter hung next to my engineering degree and my professional certifications, a strange addition to the wall of credentials. But in its own way, it represented an education just as valuable as any formal degree. An education in property rights, in standing firm, and in the importance of holding people accountable for their actions. I checked on my mother, making sure she had taken her medications and that all her equipment was functioning properly. The equipment that had started this whole saga, the medical devices that required reliable power. She was already asleep, breathing easily with the help of her oxygen concentrator. I adjusted her blanket and quietly left the room. In my own room, I could hear the faint hum of the generator through the window. It was a comforting sound now, a sound I associated with security and preparedness. I fell asleep easily, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, we were ready for it. The story of the generator and the HOA had become something of a legend in the neighborhood. New residents heard various versions of it, usually exaggerated. The details changed in the retelling, but the core message remained the same. Do not mess with Brandon Torres, and do not abuse your power as an HOA board member. I had not sought that reputation, but I did not mind it either. It kept the HOA honest. It reminded everyone that homeowners had rights. And it ensured that future board members would think twice before imposing arbitrary rules or making unreasonable demands. The following months had brought other changes to the neighborhood. The HOA had revised its entire covenant and bylaws, removing dozens of outdated and overly restrictive rules. The new documents were clear, reasonable, and focused on genuine community interests rather than aesthetic micromanagement. Every homeowner had received a copy and had been invited to provide input before the final version was adopted. The clubhouse had been fully repaired and upgraded, with the new generator installed prominently and proudly. A plaque next to it read, "Community Emergency Power System installed 2025. May we never forget the importance of preparation." Douglas had insisted on the plaque, and I had appreciated the sentiment. Several homeowners had approached me for advice on their own generator installations. I had helped them navigate the permitting process, recommend appropriate equipment, and design safe installations. It had become an unofficial side business, though I never charged my neighbors for the advice. Helping them was its own reward, and it strengthened the sense of community that had emerged from the crisis. Frank Johnson and I had become good friends. We had both been firefighters in different lives, him literally and me figuratively, as I battled the HOA. We often sat on one porch or the other in the evenings, discussing neighborhood issues, sharing stories, and keeping an eye on things. He had become my ally on various community matters, and together, we had helped guide several improvements to the neighborhood infrastructure and emergency preparedness. The next hurricane season had come and gone without incident, then another, but the neighborhood remained prepared. The generators were maintained, supplies were stockpiled, and everyone knew their roles in an emergency. The culture had fundamentally changed from one of aesthetic perfection to one of practical preparedness. Patricia's house had sold quickly after her conviction, well below market value due to the circumstances. The new family, the Johnsons had mentioned, were wonderful additions to the neighborhood. They had immediately become involved in community activities and had installed their own generator within months of moving in. I had met them at a neighborhood barbecue, and we had laughed about the generator's history when they learned who I was. We were told installing a generator was practically a requirement here, the husband had joked. Not a requirement, I had corrected with a smile. Just strongly encouraged, and definitely not banned anymore. The years had passed peacefully after that. My mother's health had remained stable, thanks in part to the reliable power and medical equipment. My business had grown with several major contracts that kept me busy and financially secure, and the neighborhood had continued to thrive under sensible HOA leadership. I had never regretted my decision to stand firm against Patricia. It had been the right thing to do, not just for me, but for the entire community. Sometimes standing up to bullies is hard, sometimes it is risky, but it is always necessary. Because, if good people do not stand up to abusive authority, that authority will only get worse. The generator continued to sit in my backyard, a quiet guardian against the uncertainties of nature and grid failures. It had been more than just equipment. It had been the catalyst for change, the tool that had exposed corruption, and the symbol of a homeowner's right to protect their family and property. And every time I heard it hum to life for its monthly test, I smiled, remembering the hurricane, the confrontation, and the eventual victory. Not a victory over nature or disaster, but a victory over petty tyranny and abuse of power. The kind of victory that might seem small in the grand scheme of things, but that meant everything to the people it affected. As I reflected on everything one final time, years after the events that had changed our neighborhood, I realized that the real lesson was not about generators or HOAs, or even about standing up to bullies. The real lesson was about community. about what happens when people work together, stand up for each other, and refuse to let anyone divide them or abuse them. Patricia had tried to rule over the community, to bend it to her vision and her will. She had failed because ultimately, a community is not about one person's vision. It is about everyone coming together, contributing their part, and creating something better than any individual could create alone. The hurricane had stripped away the pretense and revealed what really mattered. Neighbors helping neighbors, people working together, and everyone doing their part to keep each other safe. The generator had powered us through the storm, but the community spirit that emerged afterward had powered us through everything else. And that was worth more than any amount of electricity could ever be. That was the real victory, the lasting change, and the true ending to the story. In my backyard, the generator sat ready, a permanent reminder of where we had been and what we had learned. And in the neighborhood around me, people lived their lives in peace, secure in the knowledge that their HOA served them, their rights were protected, and their community was strong. That was everything I had fought for, and it had all been worth it.